I want to demonstrate my long tail EWRAP technique on this little 3D printed knitting machine. It's a technique that I came up with for the Addy type machines, those plastic circular knitting machines, because the EWRAP was sort of messy on those machines and sometimes hard to knit off. So I've used it on this machine with socks, and it comes out really neat and at the right tension. So I'm going to show how I do that. I'm going to go ahead and put my cast on bonnet on and knit a few rounds of waste yarn. Okay, I hope that the yarn that I picked will show up, but this, I cut the tail of my waste yarn, but I like to leave it in the carrier until after I get my main yarn threaded, and it kind of helps, they help to support each other until I get those stitches locked in. So I'm sitting facing the yarn carrier. I like to sit on the handle side when I'm doing the EWRAP because I can get both of my hands in here from this direction and I can see what I'm doing better. It's just easier and more coordinated for me. So I'm going to pull my main yarn in. I'm going to hang on to the waste yarn tail so that it doesn't get pulled back through until I'm ready for it. Now I need a length of yarn that is 3 times the circumference of the needles of the machine. So I'm going to go ahead and pull out enough to measure 3 times around, and that will give you enough yarn to do the long tail cast on. And I may have to keep adjusting my waste yarn tail because it wants to come through while I'm doing this. So I'm going to get everything organized here and make sure that the yarn is where it needs to be. This is my needle number 1 right here. So I have enough of the waste yarn left, the tail, to finish knitting these other needles that haven't knit. So there's several things I have to watch right now. I need to make sure that I didn't mess anything up and that the waste yarn is above the latches of these needles so that when they come down it'll stay in the hooks of those needles. So because I fold around with it so much, I have to keep an eye on these while they finish knitting and then start casting on over here. So here's my needle 1. I'm not going to do the hug method or anything like that. So what I want to do is take this yarn and wrap it clockwise around this number 1 needle. And it would be clockwise if you're looking down at the top of the needle. So I'm just going to wrap it. Let me start over. Here's this long tail that I dropped down into the middle of my sock. Okay, so I'm just going to take my right hand and hold that tail down so that I can use my left hand and wrap that yarn in a little E around that first needle. Now the first one wants to get pulled back up through the carrier, so I've got to be careful with these needles anyway, so I'm just going to kind of click forward. I'm going to watch all these, make sure they're knitting correctly. My yarn tail for the waste yarn is still sticking out of the yarn carrier. The next needle is ready to be wrapped, so I'm taking my left hand and wrapping it clockwise around that needle, trying not to split it. And I'm not pulling tight, I just want it neat in between each EWRAP, but not tight because the machine will not be able to knit it. What you want is a little X, a little cross on the back of the needle, and you want a loop on the front. If you wrap counterclockwise, the X is going to end up on the outside, and you don't want that. So I think it'll be easier for me to wrap this needle before it gets to the yarn carrier, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap it. So I've got 3 EWRAPs here, my 1, 2, 3 needles, and I'm going to crank forward, keeping an eye on my waste yarn, tap those down. After we get going, it'll get a lot easier. Once those get locked down, I'm Going to go ahead and wrap the next one. And you see I'm not pulling tight, I'm just making sure they're neat. And what is happening here is my working yarn is being fed in, and these needles are already going to start knitting those EWRAPs. So you're basically doing your first row at the same time as you're casting on. Now this first one, you're going to have to make sure that this working yarn, since it got pulled so tight, it's going to need to stay above the latch of that needle, and right now it's not wanting to. So I'm going to get this waste yarn out of the way, pull it on in, and I'm going to make sure the waste yarn is knitting above the latch. And sometimes you can kind of tap that needle down and make sure the waste yarn is in the hooks of those needles like it should be. And then I'll lift this working yarn above that latch of needle number 1 and just carefully crank forward till you know they're secure. So once the first one comes down, the rest of them should follow the leader and behave like they should. So I went ahead and wrapped the next needle, and sometimes I use my hands to turn the cylinder. Then wrap the next needle, and I'm still keeping an eye over here till these are safe. And they're starting to knit like they should. And I'm splitting my yarn, so it's not making a very good video when I do that. This yarn is really stretchy, and so it gets all curly on me, so every now and then I'll take it out of the middle of the machine and kind of straighten it out so that I don't have trouble with it. Getting my tail in there. So you're going to have a gap right here, and that's pretty much what I want. I want a clear gap there that I'll sew later when I get it off the machine. With the tail that I have left, I'll close that gap up. So you just keep E-wrapping one at a time and making sure they're knitting off over here like they should. So I'll tap them down below the latch of the needle so that it can come around and grab yarn and knit that E-wrap off. I'm hoping my hands are not in the way. It's really hard for me to show the E-wrap when my hand comes around. I hide the needle, but I'm going to try here to show you. Holding that down, and I'm coming around the needle like that. I tried all kinds of angles with my camera, and unless you're looking over my shoulder, it's hard to see what I'm doing. But if the camera is there, it gets in my way. So this is the next best option. Alright, these are knitting okay. And I'm going to continue around until I finish all of the needles. Back to needle number 1. And that one's getting hung up there. Straighten out my yarn a little bit. Let me put some weight on here and get all the kinks out of my long tail. And that's the problem with the long tail, is it's dangling down there, tangling up on itself sometimes. And you'll have to stop and make it behave every now and then. You can double this yarn, just take out twice as much as before and fold it in on itself, and you may end up with a little firmer, more obvious edge I've seen it on the flatbed knitting machines, but I've never tried it on this machine. Just want to make sure that that EWRAP drops all the way down to the waste yarn below the latch so that it can be knit off immediately. As soon as it comes around to the other side of the yarn carrier, it should be ready to grab yarn, or the needle should be ready to grab yarn and pull a stitch through that EWRAP. This is a closed edge, so that when you remove your waste yarn, it will not unravel. So that means that you can do any kind of rib pattern that you want, a 1x1, whatever your cylinder will allow when you do the math. So on mine I can do 1x1, 2x2, 3x1. So whatever multiples will work out for your cylinder, you can do what you want after you do the EWRAP, because it won't unravel. You could do a couple of eyelet rows with lace, just really anything. So my stitches are really tight, and that's because I'm getting over here on this side where it's starting to pull the stitches down, and so I'm doubling up here, so I'm kind of feeling a little stiffness there. Sometimes I'll reach under and release some of the weight, just kind of slightly lift up on the weight so it doesn't have such a hard time pulling those stitches down. Almost to the end. So I have one more needle and a gap. So I'm going to go ahead and hang weight on the end of that EWRAP, and now I can knit the number of rows that I need to for my cuff. I'm going to knit forward, and I'm going to take this first couple of rounds slow so that I can make sure that those tight stitches that knit through those EWRAPs. So what you have here is your EWRAP. You can see the little E going around right there. Let's see if I can pull down the legs of it. Let me get another hook. That's not going to work. There's your EWRAP right there. It goes around. And a lot of times it's a good idea to study your stitches at this point, because what we have is an EWRAP plus another knit stitch that is going to be above this EWRAP, and you can see that the EWRAP has been knit along with the waste yarn. And the reason it's a good idea to study which direction this goes is because when you're starting to latch up for your rib or any kind of pattern that you're doing, you may accidentally run the stitch all the way down to the EWRAP row, and you're going to have to know which way to twist it to latch back up to repair that drop stitch. So I suggest to practice an EWRAP row and then drop the stitches on purpose, and then learn how to retwist that EWRAP and latch up your row to repair any kind of mistakes. So I've demonstrated that on the Addy, but I've not had much practice repairing it on this machine. I played with it one time, and I still haven't gotten quite coordinated with it yet, because on the Addy machine everything's oriented a little bit different as far as the handles. So I'm going to knit this first row really slow, and I'm watching to make sure those stitches drop below the latches. And these get a little wonky because we have that gap there. So I'm going to knit about 6 or 7 rows and show you how to do the rib, 1x1 rib down to the EWRAP. Okay, I'm finishing up the last round, or the second to the last round. So normally I'll do no more than 6 to 10 rows for the rib because it ends up way down in the machine and you have to remove the weight so you can pull the fabric up and do your ribbing. So I usually do a lot of ribbing on my socks, so I'll do 10 rounds at a time. But for this sample I've just done a few. So when I get to the second to the last round that I'm finishing, if it's going to be my last round of my cuff, here's my needle number 1. As I'm beginning the last round that I plan on doing, I'll work my needle number 1. It's already started that round. I'll get it to where it's opposite me on this side. And I want to start my 1x1 ribbing on the second needle, so I'm going to pull it up so that I can drop that stitch. And normally I'll do it while it's still kind of right here, and it helps that stitch drop off a little better. And if you're a little nervous about it, you can go ahead and take your hook and go down there and find that EWRAP that we talked about. There's the EWRAP, and you can pull that down. You can see the waste yarn. Get my finger up in there. See the waste yarn, that green waste yarn poking through. I'm going to stick my hook in that stitch that's above that waste yarn. And that way when I drop the stitch, it's going to stop at my hook. So I'm just going to park it there. And I'm going to put my other hook behind the neck of that stitch. And normally if I push that needle down, it'll drop off, but I went too far, so I'm just going to hold the needle down and pop that stitch over like that, and then ravel it down. Now, you should already know how to latch up a rib, but if you don't, I have one loop. You can see it on my hook, and that latch is wanting to come up between. If the latch is not open, you'll have to reach under there and open it or nudge it open against one of these bars. If the latch is, let me just go ahead and latch that last bar up. Make sure you're all the way down and you only have one loop, because sometimes that last bar will not drop like it should. So what I do is I drop the old stitch, push the hook forward, make sure that old stitch is past the latch, and as the latch is coming up, it's going to grab that next bar and hook it into the hook of the needle, and you just crochet up. So if your latch closes on you like that, you can just kind of nudge it against one of those bars and grab the bar, that little ladder. And sometimes toward the end I kind of have to angle my hook to the side, but most of the time I'll just reach under and swing my sock toward me so that I'll have more room to work over here. So let me skip a needle, and then I'm looking to see if the camera's picking this up. Skip a needle, and then I pick up the next one. And then go ahead and find that waste yarn down there. Stick my hook in that first stitch above the waste yarn. Push that down and it'll start to run, and then latch up. Oops, I went down the wrong hole. So when I did that, my latch closed. And that's all there is to latching up for the ribbing. Now obviously when I get down to the end and my needle number 1, let me move this forward a little bit. Deposit that there. When I get around here and my needle number 1 is back to the beginning, there's still going to be a few needles left on that row that have not been latched up because they're kind of caught in this area. So you're going to have to go ahead and finish the round, and you'll already be starting the next round of the leg as you're finishing the last round of your ribbing. So I hope this helps. So that's how you do a ribbing next to an EWRAP cast on.